Halo semua, selamat datang di Mind Slicer. Nama gue William dan co-host gue Chloe. Dan di podcast ini kita bakal ngomongin hal-hal seputar identitas diri, kepribadian, dan psikologi. Hope you enjoy it.
Hi everyone, welcome back to my Slicer podcast, and today is our second episode of season 2. And today we're going to talk about the car model. So what is car model, Chloe?
Okay, so actually, car model is like some kind of a simple analogy when talking about your cognitive stack. So, in the previous episode, we already talked about how to determine your cognitive stack, and that consists of your first four functions. And these four functions can be divided into like several roles. Nah, the roles that they have can be put in an analogy of a car. So when you're in a car, the first and most important role is the driver. So the driver responds to your first function, cognitive stack, and then the second part of the car consists of the co-pilot, which is corresponding to the second function in your stack. And then the driver and the co-pilot, there's also the passengers, which is the 10-year-old, which is the third function. And also, lastly, we have the 3-year-old, which is your fourth function. Well, maybe you can start to describe a little bit about the driver.
So the driver parts of your cognitive functions is where you spend at 80% of your time gitu loh. Jadi it's like your comfort zone. So it's where your cognitive functions goes to, like naturally goes to. Basically, that's where you spend your time most with. So that's your driver. Driver means like, taking control of the car, right? So
Yeah.
functions that handling you
Yeah.
conscious unconsciously. Yeah, so that's what driver means. It can also be called dominant, primary, hero, or driver functions. So that's the synonym of the first functions itself.
Nah,
And it's also part of your personality that you identify with. Kalau misalnya, you can almost see in person with this instantly gitu loh. Kalau misalnya contoh INFJ, their first function is NI, you almost can see INFJ is their NI gitu loh, yang udah kelihatan banget jelas gitu loh.
yeah.
It's their dominant. So
What
the second functions, the pilot.
Yeah. So what's also equally important for the car is the co-pilot. So usually what a co-pilot does when you're in a car, right? Usually the navigator or like helping with directions and figuring out things when, getting lost gitu kan. Co-pilot kan biasanya gitu, bantu support si driver. Nah, co-pilot is not naturally the most natural function that you go to, but it's your second favorite function. That's why it corresponds to the second or auxiliary function that you have. Nah, what's interesting is that if you remember from last episode, how it works is like if the first function is introverted, the second function has to be extroverted and opposite vice versa. So this means that our co-pilot is not the natural preference that we want. Misalnya kayak aku introvert, co-pilot aku pasti extrovert. Nah itu kan sebenarnya bukan my natural state, tapi itu helps to encourage us to be more kayak exploring not only your preferred world, but also like seeing the other side, like the other world. Misalnya I'm not comfortable in the outer world and I'm more comfortable in the inner world. The co-pilot encourages me to step out of my comfort zone gitu loh. And this is actually good and very important because this helps us to grow. So the co-pilot is also known as the growth position.
So the next functions is the 10 years old, which is basically it's a, you can call it like a internal child, right?
Mm-mm.
It's an eternal child, I'm sorry. And it's a tertiary functions and it's 10 years old functions, which is, we can say that it's underdeveloped gitu loh, rather than this first functions and second functions that we have. It's basically the functions that belum dewasa banget gitu loh. So sometimes it can get defensive some ways because this is how we sometimes get fallen to if our first functions doesn't work. For example, like INFJ itu kan NI gitu loh. And the second function itself is an extrovert, right?
Yeah.
But we're not naturally used to extroverted functions, which is
Yeah.
why we fall into this tertiary functions, which is introverted also gitu loh. Jadi bisa create kind of some kind of loops, which is making things very difficult for any functions to have or any types to have, because the third function itself is underdeveloped and
Yeah.
cannot be really relied on
Mhm.
100% gitu loh.
Yeah.
Dan sometimes emang kita harus go to second functions to make a decisions gitu.
Yeah.
But
Benar.
sometimes we drop these third functions because it's where we comfortable with. That's where our nature, falls upon gitu. Because it's introverted. Misalnya kalian introverted, berarti kalian pasti third functionnya juga introverted gitu loh, which is
Mm-mm.
where you comfortable with. And extrovert juga gitu. First function extrovert dan function juga extrovert gitu. Jadi kalian jadi comfortable aja gitu loh.
Yeah, benar. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think what I want to add a bit for the third function, what's interesting is that like beda sama first function kan dua-duanya, jadi first sama third kan dua-duanya kayak what we prefer with the introverted side, misalnya kalau as an introvert gitu kan, as an extrovert it'll be extrovert, but then what's different between the first and third is like there's the third is kind of like, I don't know, I see it in a very stubborn immature way yang kayak when we're just stuck and we cannot grow, we tend to resort to this third function, which is like immature. That's why it's called the child. Nah, the third one, the fourth function, known as the inferior function or 3-year-old, is actually kind of like your blind spot. So we don't realize most of the time, we don't realize that we have this in us because again, it's called the blind spot, and sometimes this fourth function shows up when feeling stressed, and it's kind of like we don't want to admit that we have this one, but then like we have it, this function gitu, kayak tendency to overlook this function is kayak high gitu. We kind of disregard that we have this inside us gitu. But then this function, the 3-year-old, is actually quite an important one because kalau nggak salah, if you develop this function well, you can apa ya?
I think you can, I don't know if it's true though, but you can like, it's the key to your development self gitu loh. Because for example, like again, NFJ, the fourth function is SE. SE, it means like being in the moment. So for NFJ, being in the moment and appreciates, that your sensory of extrovertedness, like being here and now, is actually good for INFJ to improve themselves in the future. And it also applied to all the functions, which is their fourth functions where they're very lacking. And the focus of self-development itself is to improve yourself by improving the things that you're lacking. So basically that's the idea of why we should improve the fourth functions itself.
And also the mirror opposite of the fourth function is the first function. So if the first function, which is the driver, is your biggest strength and like who you are and like what you're comfortable with, the mirror of course will be your biggest weakness. But of course it's an area that is important to be improved upon. Ito. Na. So speaking about functions, as we mentioned before, there's not only four, but there's eight. So since we already talked about number 1, 2, 3, and 4, what about 5 to 8, Will?
So 5 to 8 itself, it's called shadow functions, which is basically a mirror to our first four functions. Basically, for example, like me, I have a mirror of ENFP. INFJ have a mirror of ENFP. Why? Well, basically, it's because of its functions. That's the main difference, right? So me and ENFP doesn't have the same functions. I mean, doesn't have the first four same functions. For example, like I am an I, my first function is an I. So my first shadow functions, which is fifth functions, is an E. And then my second functions is FE, which is my second shadow functions, which is sixth functions is FI.
Mm.
And then my third function is the I,
Mhm.
which is my third shadow functions is the E, or the seven functions is the E. And my fourth functions is SE. And my fourth shadow functions or eight functions is SI.
Yeah.
So it's the opposites of the functions, the first four functions that we have.
Mm-mm.
So the fifth function itself, it's called the opposing. We're not going to talk about this deep shadow functions because the fact that we just have a few of the data that's, I think, valid or pengetahuan tentang shadow
Shadow.
functions itself
Yeah.
and the way it affects your like your personality gitu loh. Sometimes we just talk about these top four functions gitu loh, because this fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth functions basically is just your like under your radar, basically like
Mm-mm.
you cannot see it in a way,
Mm.
cannot see it in your conscious and subconscious mind. You cannot see it in a way because it's just like overshadowing. I mean, it's being overshadowed by this fourth function.
Yeah.
So the option itself, it's what I heard is it support the second function, which is interesting because what it do is support your second function. So it's like almost this a shadow of this second function.
Mm-hmm.
It means that the fifth functions affecting the second functions.
Yeah.
For example, like I am an INFJ, which is NE affecting the FE of mine. So what does it mean? It means that NE, as you know, is a possibilities, right? Novelty and these explorations
Mm-hmm.
of something, and it supports my decisions of FE.
Yeah.
So what does it mean if FE is like harmonizing yourself between these lives and this society and these people that's around you?
Mm-hmm.
So NE itself is like going through this exploring ideas of being fit into everyone, like
Mm.
exploring ideas of how to fit in with everyone. So that's the idea of the functions itself, supporting the second functions, which is I learned from YouTube videos that's not already it's not unavailable now. Like I don't know why they deleted their YouTube channels, which is anti-support. If you happen to know this channel, but it's not available now. Yeah, it's very interesting theory itself because if it means that with function supporting the second functions, it means that every other functions itself supporting the other functions on the top four. I mean, like every shadow function supporting the top four, right?
Yeah.
So what about the six functions, Chloe?
Yeah, it's interesting this whole supporting one function supports the other. And I think this idea kind of helps us to put into consideration that maybe these shadow functions are important after all. And I mean, even though it's not our natural state, and kind of like when you go into shadow mode, it's kind of like you kind of feel out of character. It's like, who is this? Like kadang kayak, because it's very a subconscious thing gitu loh. But maybe it's important to know like what is causing, what subconscious things are happening that affects the conscious things that are happening, which is in the first four, right? Now,
Yes, yes.
the sixth function is actually called the critical parent. Now, I think just now I forgot to mention that the second function, which is your auxiliary, is also called the parent function. Nah, ini kan total kalau second sama six itu kayak di posisi kedua tapi kayak satu shadow satu enggak. Jadi benar-benar di opposite-nya, makanya namanya critical parent. Nah, the difference between the critical parent and the normal parent, which is the second, is that the second one promotes growth and like, you know, helps you build yourself gitu kan. Kalau critical parent tuh very apa ya, kayak hypercritical and belittles and kadang kayak harsh and being hard on yourself gitu. And this critical parent supports the third function, which is the eternal child yang udah dibahas tadi sama Will. Nah, kalau for example, let's use aku ya. My eternal child is SI. SI is memory. And my critical parent, NI, which is perspective, right? And then I think what I can see from this is like when I get into my SI thinking, and I'm feeling quite defensive, misalnya kayak I'm going as a third function kan sometimes it's like your comfort zone tapi in a bad way, kayak comfort zone yang doesn't like inhibits your growth gitu loh, kayak I go back to SI memory. Jadi kayak I have this thing where I go back to the past, you know, like and tend to dwell on the past, misalnya memory gitu kan. Nah, what I see the critical parent does kan, and I itu kan tentang kayak perspective gitu kan, and making a conclusion. So what I see is like, oh, this thing happened in the past, and which concludes that you are misalnya kayak you're a horrible person because you did this ini, kayak apa ya, kayak langsung bikin kind of conclusion that because it happened, therefore you are like this. And I think that's very like that critical side can be very apa ya, inhibiting sometimes. But then ya gimana ya, kayak self-reflect mulu gitu loh. That's what I see the critical parent. Kalau yang ketujuh nih, gimana namanya, trickster. Aku sebenarnya kurang ngerti. Coba dijelasin deh, Will.
Yeah, so the seventh function itself, it's called trickster, which is like the shadow of your third functions, basically. So it means that, for example, like me, INFG, which I have, the third function is TI, so I have TI in my seven functions. So we can call this seven function itself because these functions is especially it support our fourth functions, you know. And the thing that you said earlier, the thing about the fourth functions, you said that it's your blind spot, right? So it's the hard things to do. Like for example, like me, NFJ, I'm very hard to do the SE part of my functions because it drained my energy, and to be in focus moments is very hard, and it's really drain my energy, and it's not our functions that we are naturally prone to, you know, and it's taking a lot of energy. And I think the trickster, the seven functions, is harder than that because it's almost this unconsciously hard. Because, for example, like me, SE, which is supported by the seven functions TE, so TE is supported SE. So it means that, for example, like I'm doing task which is needed to, you know, focus on the moment of now. Yeah, I can do it, but I cannot do it effectively. So what does it mean? It means that I might just do it randomly. Effectiveness is about the system of getting accomplishment and getting things done. And sometimes I don't have that. I just have this systems that pretty much random and don't have this effectiveness, quote unquote effectiveness things, effectiveness systems.
Yeah.
And that's very hard to really fix this TE. I think the real blind spot itself, it might be the seven functions, because it's
Mm.
something that very unconsciously blind.
And
So
last but not least, we have the eighth function, which is called the demon. So it's the apa ya, the most this last function in your stack is like something you're very very unfamiliar with, and like you just can't relate to orang yang biasanya misalnya kalau eight function, kamu ketemu orang yang eight functionnya dominannya mereka, biasanya tuh nggak bisa relate sama nih orang, soalnya kayak emang it's just not how, it's like our lowest priority in choosing the cognitive function, right? And sometimes we kind of, again, it's called demon because we kind of demonize the person that is associated with using this function gitu loh. Kayak misalnya kayak kadang kan aku eighth functionnya TI. Nah biasanya tuh kayak aku lihat orang yang TI itu kayak apa ya, kayak nggak bisa aja nyambung, ngerti nggak sih, kayak it's really not natural to me on how people use this TI. And what's funny is actually this TI is what supports the eighth function, the demon shadow function, is actually the one that supports your first function, which is the one you're most comfortable with. Yeah, and the one that you most know. So actually, I don't know, that's a bit confusing to me how I could, I'm still trying to process that. Like misalnya TI aku nge-support FI misalnya as an INFP ya. TI kan accuracy, FI kan authenticity. I think the way I see it is that like I have this urge of really really wanting to collect an accurate data that supports what I value gitu. Jadi kayak I really really want to find out and what I like and I don't like. Misalnya kayak aku nggak mau kayak, so I'm very picky with what I put in as like what is authentic to me gitu loh, what I value. I think that's how my TI supports my FI.
yeah. I agree.
And actually, I wanna ask a bit question, like, what do you think about the shadow functions? Well, like, are they good or are they bad? Or like, I know for the first 1 to 4, we should apa ya, try to develop each one, 1, 2, 3, and 4, because that's what we're mostly using. But sometimes these shadow functions kadang kita kan kayak put it aside aja. So do you think it's good or bad?
I feel very neutral about it. I guess it's just facts that we are subconsciously or I'm sorry, the functions that we are unconsciously very, very unrealized. The bad things about that is we don't realize it and we don't know for sure how it affects our personality and cognitive functions. But the positive side of it is something about these functions. I mean, I don't know if it's a good thing, but it's something. The functions itself, the bottom 4, which is a shadow functions, is sometimes the key to our growth, to our self development. This this all types. Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, according to Carl Jung, so the shadow kan lies at the edge of our conscious gitu katanya. Jadi kayak how I see it, it's 1 until 4 tuh conscious, 5 until 8 tuh kayak apa ya, unconscious kita gitu. It's like the repressed side of our identity, I guess. And like it's the opposite of our ego gitu. And I think they can be both a good and a bad thing, because gimana ya, kayak in a way that it can be highly destructive. Like misalnya tadi it tries to apa ya? It's very kayak misalnya tadi critical parent tuh critical, terus kayak what I see shadow function tuh kayak a reflection gitu, kayak how we kind of look back and see the reasons behind things gitu loh. Kan misalnya nomor 5 support 2, 6 support. There's like this supports this. It's like what happens below it, you know? It's like kind of like the reasoning behind it. So I feel like it's good to have a self-reflection, but then if you dwell on it too long, it can be quite destructive. So it can be good or bad. It can be good or bad gitu kayak. We should
Yeah.
definitely not, I don't think we should try to develop our shadow, but I think we should acknowledge that it exists gitu.
I think the shadow itself, something that we should acknowledge and really learn about. And I think it might be the key to understanding ourselves better.
Yeah. I also read this interesting thing. It says like the shadow can also step in when we become ego inflated and need to have a reality check of our weaknesses gitu. Jadi kayak ya kalau terlalu di ego kan kayak kadang kita lupa sama our weaknesses.
Yeah, I think it's a balanced thing, and it's also good to really view it from a shadow.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I think this is it. Thank you everyone for listening to our podcast, and see you next time.
Okay, goodbye.
Yeah.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Mind Slicer. See you again next week.